Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
In the heart of a Montana blizzard, where the wind howled like a grieving mother, a deal was being struck in the currency of human flesh. Ilara stood shackled to a wagon, her belly swollen with a child who had yet to know a single moment of peace. The iron chains on her wrists were colder than the ice forming on her lashes, a brutal reality against the fierce, protective warmth she felt for the life inside her. Across the snow-swept clearing, her own brother, Jedediah, finalized her sale to a rancher whose eyes held the same dead emptiness as the winter landscape. "She won't run," Jedediah promised, the silver gleam of a new Colt pistol in his hand, a testament to his betrayal. But then, a jolt. A powerful, insistent kick from within her womb, not a flutter of life, but a demand for it. It was a declaration of war from an unborn soul, a secret call to arms only she could hear. In that instant, a fire ignited in the frozen landscape of her heart. As the wagon lurched forward, she twisted with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, slamming her body against her captor. A chain link snapped, and with a desperate gasp, she threw herself from the wagon, plunging into the deep, suffocating snow. Gunshots echoed behind her, lost in the storm, as she scrambled to her feet and ran, a lone, bleeding figure against the infinite, unforgiving white. Will this desperate flight for 2 lives lead to freedom, or a frozen grave in the wilderness? And what happens when a woman running from monsters stumbles into the den of a man who has become one himself? Stay with us to witness a story of survival, sacrifice, and the unlikely warmth of a fire lit in the coldest of nights. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every heartbeat is a battle won. Part 1. A Debt of Blood, a Whisper of Snow. 7s. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets, a final shroud over the dying lands of Montana. White swallowed brown, ice covered rot, and mercy was a word forgotten by the wind. At the edge of a frostbitten cattle yard, Ilara stood shackled to a wagon, not like a woman, but like a mule bound for slaughter. She was 22, her belly round with a life that had only ever known turmoil, her lips cracked and bleeding from a cold that seeped into her bones. A few feet away, her brother Jedediah negotiated with a rancher named Bartholomew Thorne, a man who smelled of whiskey, leather, and the casual cruelty of ownership. In Ilara's world, there were no saviors, only buyers. The rusted chains binding her wrists were a familiar language, but the steady, insistent pulse of the child inside her was a new and ferocious dialect. "She's healthy," Jedediah said, his voice as dry and barren as the landscape. "Strong legs. Doesn't talk much. 7 months, she was, but the baby would come clean, a fresh asset." Thorne looked her up and down, his eyes dead pools of winter ice. "And she don't run." Jedediah's grin was a gash in his thin face, a flicker of triumph in the biting wind. "She won't," he promised. "Not anymore." That was when it happened. A kick. Not the usual flutters, not the slow, gentle rolls of a growing child exploring its first home. No, this was a jolt, powerful and urgent, like a fist knocking from the inside out, a prisoner demanding release. Ilara's breath caught, her spine stiffening into a rod of iron. Another kick, and then another, each one not a pang of pain, but a fierce command. Fight. She closed her eyes, the snow clinging to her lashes like frozen tears, and whispered a vow into the heart of the storm, a promise meant only for the life she carried. "I hear you, baby. I hear you." And I swear I won't let them sell you, too. The wagon creaked under Thorne's weight as he prepared to haul his new property back to his land. Chains scraped against frozen wood as one of his men yanked her toward the rear. Jedediah did not look back. The silver-plated colt he'd just received for his flesh and blood gleamed in his hand, a cold piece of metal already warm with his triumph. He waited until the wagon wheel hit a stump, just enough of a lurch, just enough of a shift in balance. Then Ilara moved. She twisted, a sudden, violent corkscrew of desperation, slamming her shoulder into the man beside her. The chain, stretched taut, caught against a protruding rail hook. There was a sharp crack of stressed metal, a grunt of surprise from her captor, and the shackle on her left wrist snapped open. The rancher cursed, a foul word ripped away by the wind. She didn't hesitate. She rolled, feet hitting the deep snow, knees buckling, her body falling down, down into the blinding white, into the brutal cold, into a sliver of impossible freedom. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. Her belly hit first, and a lance of pure agony shot up her side, but the adrenaline was afire in her veins. Before they could scream, before they could even register the empty space where she had stood, she was up, limping, bleeding, running. Behind her, men shouted, their surprise turning to rage. Boots crunched in the snow, the sound of pursuit a drumbeat of death at her back. But she did not stop. She did not look back. Branches slapped her face like angry hands, and ice-crusted twigs sliced at her skin until the world became a blur of gray trees, white snow, and the bright, hot red of her own blood. Her breath tore through her throat in ragged sobs, each exhale a cloud of steam, each inhale a knife of frozen air. Blood dotted the snow behind her, bright crimson flowers blooming against the pale ground. Her boots were soaked, her thin coat a useless rag against the wind's teeth, her body fragile and screaming in protest. But she ran. She ran because inside her was someone else, and that someone was not for sale. She could feel it, the tiny heartbeat that was not hers, pounding in frantic rhythm with her own, a twin drum in the symphony of fear. The baby did not cry, but she felt its presence, a force that reached through her fear, a silent, powerful push, a will that screamed into her soul. "Run, Mama!" Run. So she did. Through ancient pine trees that had stood sentinel over 1,000 such snows, past crows who watched from barren branches, too cold to bother scattering. Over ridges no human foot had touched that winter, she scrambled, her lungs burning, her knees screaming, her arms clutched around her belly like a living shield. No one had ever protected her. Not her father, long dead from a bottle of cheap whiskey. Not her mother, buried under a tombstone of sadness. And certainly not Jedediah, who was at that very moment trading her body for a weapon. But she could protect this child. She would. Even if it killed her. Twilight began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and gray. The snow deepened, and the wind howled low and long, like a wolf hunting alone. Her pace slowed, her vision blurring at the edges. Her fingers had lost all feeling hours ago. Still, she pressed on, driven by the primal, unthinking instinct of a mother protecting her young. Then, her foot slipped on a patch of hidden ice. She tumbled, not falling far, but landing heavily in a short ravine, a drift so deep it swallowed half her body in its soft, suffocating embrace. The cold knocked her silent. For a long moment, she could not move. could not think, could not even feel the pain. And then, another kick. Softer this time. Not urgent. Not afraid. Just present. A quiet affirmation. I'm still here. I'm here, she whispered, her lips so blue they were nearly black, her voice a cracked shard of ice. We're still here. With strength she did not know she possessed, she clawed forward, dragging herself through the snow. The trees circled her like silent judges, their shadows creeping longer as the last of the light died. And then she saw it. A light. Small, faint, but steady. It flickered through the woods, just above the ridge she had fallen from. A cabin, maybe. A fire, perhaps. A chance. Ilara did not smile. She did not cry. She just moved. Slow. One breath at a time. One prayer with every agonizing inch. Behind her, the snow kept her secrets, for now. Ahead, warmth or death. She would take either, so long as it was not a cage. She pressed her hand to her stomach again, the baby quiet now, still, trusting. Hold on, little one, she whispered into the encroaching dark. Mama's not done yet. The wind shifted just after dusk, carrying a scent that wasn't pine or snow or frozen earth. Silas froze mid-swing, his axe halfway through a log. He tilted his head, listening. Years alone in these woods had sharpened his senses beyond the clumsy needs of speech, turning him into a creature of instinct. The sound was faint, nearly lost in the howl of the wind, ragged, human breathing, and something softer, a desperate scraping beneath it. He dropped the axe, its head sinking into the wood with a dull thud. He moved through the tree line with a speed and silence that defied his size, his boots crunching lightly over the snow. A lifetime of silence had made him a shadow. He saw the trail easily. Broken branches, disturbed snow, and a whisper of blood. Not animal, then human. He found her crumpled at the bottom of the ravine, a broken sparrow against the vast white canvas. One hand was curled protectively over her swollen belly. Her lips were blue, her hair matted with ice, and a line of blood had crusted along her temple from a gash on her forehead. The child within her was obvious, 7 months, maybe 8. Still, her body curled as if she could shield the unborn with sheer will alone. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, barely focusing, but her mouth formed a single, shattered word. Help! Silas crouched, his brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in cold, hard calculation. Snow had already half covered her. Wolves would find her before dawn. If they didn't, the cold would. Either way, she would not make it on her own. A part of him, the part that had kept him alive by seeking solitude, screamed at him to turn back. She was trouble. She was the world of men and their cruelties, a world he had shed like a snakeskin years ago. Leaving her was the safe thing to do, the logical thing. His peace was a fragile, bitter thing, and she was a stone cast into his frozen pond. But then his eyes fell on the way her hand rested on her belly, a gesture of such fierce, hopeless love that it struck him like a physical blow. The image of another woman, another belly, another life promised and then stolen, flashed behind his eyes. He saw fire, heard screams, smelled the acrid smoke that had choked out his entire world. He remembered his Clara, his little girl, and the wife he couldn't save. He had been helpless then, a man turned to ash by grief. This woman, freezing to death in his woods, was a ghost of that failure. To leave her here would not just be an act of indifference, it would be a surrender to the very same helplessness that had haunted his every waking moment. He stood up straight, his gaze sweeping the trees, reading the story she had left behind. Tracks. Multiple sets of boots, heavier than hers, deep heel prints, men with weight, and the splayed tracks of horses nearby. They would come looking. He worked fast, a blur of frantic, silent purpose. He snatched up pine branches, dragging them behind him as he walked, sweeping over the blood trail, erasing her path. He kicked snow across every footprint she had left, looping the path to confuse any tracker. In the brush behind her, where she'd first entered the woods, he found one of his old snare traps and reset it, quick and clean. Not for animals. For men. If they followed, they would limp back to wherever they came from. He returned to her. She had stopped shivering, a dangerously bad sign. A long, weary sigh escaped him through his nose. Then, without a word, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. She was light, far too light for a woman carrying a child. Her breath still came, soft and faint against his chest. "Damn waste," he muttered to the uncaring wind. "Freezing to death with a baby. What kind of idiot leaves you out here?" He adjusted her weight against his chest, turned, and started walking east. His cabin was a half-mile away, hidden in a thicket of evergreens, its roof draped in a heavy blanket of snow. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The fire only burned when it was absolutely needed. He had not expected to need it again this week. He kicked the door open with one boot, careful not to jostle her too much, and carried her into the single, dark room. He lowered her onto a cot beside the cold stove, a ghost laid to rest. The room smelled of pine tar, old wool, and iron. It was clean, though bare, a space stripped of everything but function. And memory. He had brought the storm inside. Part 2. The Hearth and the Holster. Sevens. Ilara woke to the crackle of a steady fire and the scent of pinewood smoke. For a moment, she was adrift in a sea of non-memory, the world quiet, still, and strangely soft. She blinked, her head sinking into a pillow stuffed with straw and old, clean wool. Her fingers curled around a blanket draped across her lap, a heavy, coarse thing made of buffalo hide, but it was warmer than anything she had ever known. She sat up slowly, a groan escaping her lips as every muscle screamed in protest. The cabin was small, compact, a testament to a life lived with function, not charm. A low shelf held a few tin mugs, a kettle, and a bundle of dried herbs. Beside the stove, a pot of stew simmered, steam still rising in gentle wisps, and a wooden spoon rested next to it, an unspoken invitation. A small candle flickered on a table, its light dancing with the much larger, wilder light of the fire in the hearth. And there, cradled in a corner like a long-held secret, stood a wooden cradle. It was simple, old, hand-carved from a lighter wood than the rest of the cabin. Her breath caught in her throat. The cradle was not new. One of its legs had been carefully mended with a darker piece of wood and a leather strap, a repair made with patient, loving hands. It had been placed with care, angled just so to catch the fire's warmth, its interior lined with a folded, faded quilt. She looked down at her own belly, swollen and prominent beneath the coarse wool shirt someone had put on her, and the baby kicked, once, a soft, present flutter. "We're safe," she whispered to the child, though the word felt foreign on her tongue. Her rescuer was not there, but his presence lingered in every rough-edged kindness. A wooden comb, sanded smooth to prevent splinters, lay beside the candle. A leather strap hung by the door, likely for her boots, which were now sitting near the hearth, drying slowly. And beside the pot of stew, a folded scrap of paper held a single line written in rough, squared handwriting, as if the letters themselves had been chopped from wood. "Don't burn the stew. Don't lift anything heavy. Your belly is big as a grain barrel." A smile touched Ilara's lips. It came unexpectedly, a flicker of warmth breaking through a permafrost of fear. He was a man of few words, even on paper. The door opened with a gust of frigid air, and he was there, filling the frame, a giant of a man carrying an armload of firewood. It was Silas. He nodded at her once, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture. "You're up." Her voice was a hoarse whisper. "I am." He grunted, a sound of acknowledgement, not conversation. He set the wood down by the stove with a heavy thud that shook the floorboards. She watched him as he moved, his efficiency precise, like a man who had learned to waste nothing, not emotion, not a word, not a breath. His beard was thick and untamed, his flannel shirt patched at the elbow, and his boots left tracks of snow that melted in slow, dark puddles on the wood floor. I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling small and inadequate. "Don't," he cut her off, his back to her as he pulled off his thick gloves. "I don't do things to be thanked." He moved to the stew pot, lifted the lid, and sniffed it, then added a pinch of salt from a small wooden bowl. "You needed heat. Woods have a claim on things that get left in the snow. Didn't want it to have a claim on you." He grabbed a bowl from the shelf, then paused, glancing back at her. "Not that one," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Blue one's lighter. Less to carry." Ilara blinked. He had thought of everything. She took the chipped blue enamel bowl as he ladled the thick, savory stew into it. She sat at the small table, sipping slowly. The warmth filled her chest and belly like something holy, chasing away the last of the deep, biting cold. Silas didn't sit. He moved around the room like a caged bear, checking the shutters, adjusting the damper on the stove, always moving, always creating a buffer of space and silence between them. As her eyes drifted across the cabin, something on the high mantel above the hearth caught her attention. It was a crudely carved picture frame, the work of an unsteady, childish hand. Inside, there was no photograph, just a name etched into the soft wood with a looping, uncertain script. Clara. Her gaze lifted to meet his. "Your daughter?" Silas froze mid-step, his hand halfway to the door latch. For a second, his entire body went rigid, his jaw so tight she could see the muscles bunch beneath his beard. Then, the tension broke with a slow, heavy exhale. "Yes." A silence stretched between them, not heavy, just wide and deep, like a canyon where grief still echoed. "Is she not here?" He finally turned, but his eyes looked past her, at the flames in the hearth. "She was. Long time ago." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a man reciting a fact he had worn smooth with time. "Fire took her. The house didn't stand much longer after that." Ilara's hands went still on the warm bowl. "I'm sorry." He gave that same single, sharp nod. "Me too." She rose slowly, her body aching, and walked over to the cradle by the fire, running a hand along its smooth, worn edge. This was hers. His answer was another quiet, yes. She could feel the weight of all the lullabies that had been sung over it, all the tiny breaths it had held. "I cry for mine, too," Elara whispered, her hand resting on her own belly. "And she's not even born yet." Silas finally looked at her then, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not a hardened recluse, but a man utterly and completely broken. The look vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar wooden mask. "I'm not good at saving people," he stated, turning away again. "Never was." He grabbed his coat from a peg. "You saved me." He shook his head, his hand on the door. "No. I just hate seeing things freeze." Before he left, he added, his voice low, "But I can keep someone warm. That I can still do." And then he was gone again, out into the snow, leaving her alone with the ghosts in his cabin. She sat near the cradle, the fire crackling, the shadows dancing, and for the first time in a long, long time, she did not feel like she was waiting to be discarded. She felt, somehow, found. The world outside Silas's cabin was not as quiet. In the muddy, half-frozen streets of Solitude's End, the nearest town, Bartholomew Thorne slammed a shot of whiskey down on a saloon bar. The liquid sloshed over the rim, but he didn't seem to notice. His face was a thundercloud of fury. "She made a fool of me, Jedediah," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "My men, my wagon, my time. And you," he jabbed a finger into Jedediah's chest, "you swore she was broken." Jedediah, nursing his own drink, flinched. The new colt on his hip felt heavy and useless. "She ain't never done nothing like that before, Mr. Thorne. I swear." The cold must have made her crazy. Thorne let out a short, ugly laugh. "Or the brat in her belly made her smart. It doesn't matter. You owe me a debt. You brought me damaged goods that then proceeded to steal themselves. I want my property back, or I'll take the value of it out of your hide." He leaned in closer, his whiskey-sour breath washing over Jedediah. "We do this my way now. We use the law. This ain't some wild squaw who ran off. She's a white woman. People notice." They left the saloon and stomped through the mud to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody looked up from his paperwork as they entered, his eyes lingering on Thorne's expensive coat and Jedediah's shifty gaze. Brody was a man worn down by the frontier, his face a roadmap of long winters and short tempers. He'd seen every kind of trouble this land could cook up, and he could smell it on these two from across the room. "Sheriff," Thorne began, his tone oozing a false respect. "My name is Bartholomew Thorne. I've been robbed." Brody leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. "Robbed of what?" "A girl. My indentured servant," Thorne said carefully. "Ran off with a horse and several items of value." He produced a piece of paper, a hastily scrawled contract signed with Jedediah's mark. "This man," he gestured to Jedediah, "transferred her contract to me yesterday. She fled during the transport." Brody's eyes narrowed. He'd seen contracts like this before. They were barely legal slavery, a way for men like Thorne to own people without calling it that. "And the girl's name?" "Elara," Jedediah mumbled, avoiding the sheriff's gaze. "My sister." Brody's eyes flicked to Jedediah, his expression hardening with contempt. He knew the type. He also knew the lands around his town better than anyone. There was only one place a person on foot could hope to find shelter from that blizzard yesterday, and it was a place no one ever went. "We have reason to believe," Thorn continued, "that she may have headed north, into the woods, toward the old logging trail." Brody stood up. He knew exactly where the old logging trail led. To Silas's cabin. He remembered Silas from before the fire, a man who could build a house with his own 2 hands and who laughed so loud it shook the rafters. He also remembered the hollowed-out man Silas had become after. A man who wanted nothing from the world but to be left alone with his ghosts. "I'll look into it," Brody said, his voice flat. Thorn smiled, a predator's smile. "See that you do, Sheriff. I expect the law in this town to protect a man's property." After they left, Sheriff Brody stood by the window for a long time, watching the gray sky. He didn't believe for a second that this Ilara was a common thief. He also knew that Silas wouldn't take in a stranger, not unless the circumstances were dire. Something was wrong with this picture, deeply wrong. But Thorn was a man with money and influence, and the law, flawed as it was still the law. With a heavy sigh, he strapped on his gun belt, pulled on his thick coat, and walked out toward the stables. The long ride to Silas's cabin would be cold, and he had a feeling the conversation waiting for him at the end of it would be even colder. Part 3. A line drawn in snow. Sevens. The days that followed fell into a fragile, unspoken rhythm. Ilara's strength slowly returned, the deep ache in her bones receding with each bowl of stew, each night of uninterrupted sleep by the fire. She learned the cabin's language, the specific creak of the floorboard near the door that announced Silas's return, the way the wind whistled a different tune through the chimney when a storm was gathering. She and Silas existed in a shared silence, orbiting each other like 2 solitary planets that had drifted into the same strange gravity. Words were a currency they rarely spent. Instead, they communicated through actions. When he saw her struggling to mend a tear in her thin dress, a needle and a spool of thick, dark thread appeared on the table the next morning. When he returned from his trap lines with hands raw and chapped from the cold, he found a tin cup of warm, herb-infused water waiting for him by the stove. It was a language of survival, of mutual respect born from shared solitude. Yet, a current of tension ran beneath the quiet surface. Every snap of a twig outside, every shadow that danced too wildly in the firelight, sent a jolt of fear through Ilara. She was safe, but she was not free. She was a secret in a small wooden box, and she knew the world had not stopped looking for her. The peace was shattered one afternoon by a sound that did not belong. The steady, rhythmic plodding of a horse, moving with purpose through the snow. Silas, who had been sharpening the head of his axe by the fire, went utterly still. He didn't look up, but his entire body became an instrument of listening. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. He rose without a sound, placing the axe back on its hooks by the door, not a tool anymore, but a statement. He gestured for her to move to the far corner of the cabin, away from the single window. "Stay quiet," he murmured, the first direct command he had ever given her. The horse stopped outside. Heavy footsteps crunched in the snow, followed by a firm, authoritative knock on the door. It wasn't the sound of a predator, but something almost worse. The sound of order, of the world they were hiding from. Silas opened the door. On the threshold stood Sheriff Brody, his face etched with weariness, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Silas," Brody said, his voice gravelly. "Been a while. Silas simply nodded, his large frame blocking most of the doorway, a human wall between the man on his porch and the woman inside. "Brody, what brings the law this far out?" The sheriff's eyes scanned the woods behind Silas, as if looking for something he didn't want to find. "Just making my rounds. Cold snap's been hard on everyone. Your trap lines holding up?" It was a dance, a careful circling of the truth. "They're fine," Silas said, his voice flat. Brody shifted his weight, his gaze finally meeting Silas's. "Couple of newcomers in town. A rancher named Thorne and a shifty fella claiming to be his partner. Say they're looking for a runaway. A young woman." Silas's expression did not change. He was a mountain, immovable and unreadable. "This is the last place a person would run to, Brody. You know that." The sheriff sighed, a long, tired sound. "I do. But this Thorne, he's the kind of man who likes to file paperwork. Says she stole from him." Just then, a log in the hearth shifted, sending a loud pop through the cabin. Brody's eyes flickered towards the sound, his gaze moving past Silas's shoulder into the dim interior. For a fraction of a second, his eyes widened. He didn't see Ilara, who was pressed into the shadows, but he saw the small, blue enamel bowl sitting on the table next to Silas's larger one. He saw the corner of the buffalo hide blanket, finer than anything Silas owned, draped over the cot. He saw evidence of a second life in a place that for 5 years had held only one. He knew. His gaze returned to Silas, and in that moment, a silent, profound understanding passed between the two men. Brody had come here as the law, but he was looking at a man he had once known, a good man shattered by a fate he didn't deserve. He saw the ghost of that good man now, standing guard over another soul in trouble. Brody's shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in decision. He had weighed the official complaint of a wealthy stranger against the silent plea of a man he respected, and his conscience had chosen its side. "Well," Brody said, pulling his collar tighter around his neck, "nothing up here but snow and memories. I'll tell 'em they're wasting their time." He turned to leave, then paused. "Silas," he said, his voice low, "a storm's comin'. Not the snowy kind. Thorne's not the type to give up easy. You best be ready for it." Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, his lone figure slowly disappearing into the gray afternoon. When the sound of the hoofbeats had faded completely, Silas finally closed the door. He leaned against it, the wood groaning under his weight. Ilara stepped out of the shadows, her body trembling. "He knows," she whispered. "Yes," Silas said, his voice grim. "But he's not the one we need to worry about." The sheriff's visit left a new kind of chill in the air, a sense of borrowed time. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by a constant, humming dread. That dread paid a visit late the next day. Ilara was sitting in the rocking chair, darning one of Silas's socks, an act of domesticity that felt both strange and deeply comforting, when Silas, who was outside splitting the last of the afternoon logs, suddenly went still. He dropped the wedge and straightened up, his head cocked, his eyes fixed on the dense tree line to the south. Ilara couldn't hear anything but the wind, but she saw the change in him. The quiet guardian was gone, replaced by a predator sensing a threat to its territory. He came inside in 2 long strides, his movements urgent but silent. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. not the law. He pulled her to her feet. "Come on. Quick!" He led her to the back of the cabin, to a small pantry area stacked with jars of preserves and dried meats. He kicked aside a bearskin rug on the floor, revealing a subtle seam in the floorboards and a small, inset iron ring. He pulled it, and a section of the floor lifted away, revealing a dark, cramped space below. The air that rose from it smelled of damp earth and cedar. "In there," he commanded. "Take the blanket. Stay low. No matter what you hear." Ilara's heart pounded with a suffocating rhythm. The thought of being in that dark, enclosed space was terrifying, but the look in his eyes was more terrifying still. She obeyed without question, easing herself down into the crawl space, her pregnant belly making the descent awkward and clumsy. Silas handed her a thick wool blanket, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a brief, electric moment. Then he lowered the trapdoor, and the world went black. She could hear him dragging the heavy rug back into place just as the sound of approaching footsteps reached the cabin. The door burst open without a knock. 2 men spilled inside, bringing the cold and the stench of unwashed bodies with them. Well, look what we got here," one of them sneered. "A regular hermit's paradise." Ilara held her breath, pressing her ear to the cold earth, listening through the floorboards. She could hear their heavy boots scraping on the wood just inches above her head. "Where is she?" The other man's voice demanded. "Don't know who you're talking about." Silas's voice rumbled, low and steady. It was the calmest sound in the room, and the most dangerous. "Don't play dumb with us, lumberjack." The sheriff might be a soft-hearted old fool, but Mr. Thorne ain't. "We saw the tracks. We know she came this way." There was a crash, the sound of a tin mug being swept from the shelf. "She ain't here," Silas said again, his voice dropping even lower. "And if she was, I'd say the same thing. Now get out of my house before you start wondering what you smell like to the wolves." A tense silence followed. Ilara could picture it. Silas standing there, not moving, his sheer size a threat. The axe would be by the door, within easy reach. The men above were weighing their options, measuring their greed against their fear. "Maybe he's telling the truth," one of them finally muttered, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Ain't worth getting chopped for. Let's go." The footsteps retreated. The door slammed shut, and the cabin was plunged back into silence. Ilara waited, her body cramped, her lungs burning for air. What felt like an eternity passed. Then, she heard the rug being dragged aside, and the trapdoor opened, flooding the dark space with the warm, golden light from the fire. Silas stood there, his face a mask of grim fury, his axe now held loosely in one hand. "They're gone," he said. "For now." He helped her out, his grip on her arm strong and steady. She stumbled into the light, shaky and blinking back tears. They would come back. They both knew it. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a target. The illusion of safety had been completely shattered. Ilara looked at Silas, seeing the hard set of his jaw, the storm in his eyes. The man who wanted only to be left alone had been backed into a corner. And in that corner, he had made a choice. He was no longer just a passive rescuer. He was a protector. He looked from her to the cradle in the corner, and a profound shift occurred in his eyes. The haunted, broken man receded, and in his place stood a guardian, a man with a purpose he hadn't had in 5 long years. He had drawn a line in the snow when he brought her in. Now, the world had tried to cross it. "They'll be back," he said, his voice no longer flat, but imbued with a hard, resonant certainty. "With more men. Maybe with Thorn himself." He met her gaze, and what he said next changed everything. "We can't stay here. I know a place. An old woman who knows herbs, lives down by the river pass. She owes me nothing, which means she can't be bought." He began gathering supplies, his movements fast and efficient. A knife, a rope, blankets, a small pouch of dried meat. The passive waiting was over. He was no longer reacting to the threat, he was moving against it. He was taking control. "Why?" Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Silas paused his packing and looked at her, a long, searching look that seemed to cross the chasm of their shared grief and loneliness. His answer was as gruff and practical as ever, but it held the weight of a sacred vow. "Because I don't leave fires to go out on their own." He handed her a scarf. "Wrap up. We ride at dawn." Chak Chan Roy. Han trin thuk sugyo moi bat jao. Hoja roi koi noi tru anduin hat. Vagio jai. Ho fai joy mat voi sutan han kuathien hien va tim kiem mutia hivong mongman o kwai konjuong. Moi kwan he kua ho se juok ta tachva han jut strong vung lei kua hiem nagai. Jai la fan tiep theo kua kuok han trin. Part 4. The Devil's Mire and the River's Grace. Sevens. They left before the sun had breached the horizon, slipping away from the cabin like ghosts into a world of blue-gray twilight. The small wooden structure, which had been Ilara's entire world, shrank behind them, swallowed by the silent, snow-laden pines until it was nothing more than a memory. There was no time for sentiment. Silas had packed with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing for a long march. He had one horse, a sturdy, stoic creature as quiet as its owner. He had insisted Ilara ride, arranging a nest of furs and blankets for her on its back. He walked ahead, rifle in one hand, leading the horse by a rope with the other, his boots sinking deep into the untrodden snow. Their journey was a descent into a harsher, more primal world than the one contained within the cabin's 4 walls. Silas did not take the easy paths. He led them through treacherous, snow-choked ravines and across half-frozen streams where black water churned angrily beneath a fragile skin of ice. The wind was a constant predator, clawing at them with invisible talons, seeking any sliver of exposed skin. The landscape was a devil's mire, designed to trap and kill the unwary. Yet, Silas moved through it with a quiet, unnerving competence. He read the snow, the trees, the direction of the wind, navigating the wilderness not with a map, but with an instinct born from years of solitude and survival. He knew which snowdrifts hid crevasses, and which ice patches would hold his weight. He was a part of this brutal world, and for the first time, Ilara understood that the very thing that made him seem so hard and remote was the only thing keeping them alive. She watched his broad back, a dark, steady shape against the overwhelming white, and a feeling she couldn't name began to take root in her heart. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a profound, aching sense of trust. She was, for the first time in her life, in the care of a man who asked for nothing in return. Her own body was a constant, dull torment. The child inside her felt impossibly heavy, and every jolt of the horse sent a sharp pain through her lower back. But she did not complain. She bit her lip against the pain, huddled deeper into the furs, and kept her eyes fixed on the man leading them toward an unknown hope. That night, he found them shelter in a shallow cave, a rocky overhang protected from the wind. He built a small, smokeless fire with the skill of a magician, its heat a small circle of defiance against the vast, freezing dark. He handed her the larger portion of their dried meat and a tin mug of melted snow, heated over the flames. As they sat in the flickering firelight, the silence between them changed. It was no longer a barrier, but a shared space. "Clara," Ilara said, the name a soft puff of steam in the cold air. I saw the name. On the mantel. Silas, who had been staring into the flames, did not flinch, but a stillness came over him, the stillness of a man bracing for a blow. He was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "She was my daughter." He pulled a small object from beneath his shirt. It was the burnt silver locket, hanging from a leather cord. It was blackened and twisted on one side, a relic from a fire. He didn't open it. He just held it in his large, calloused palm, his thumb rubbing over the damaged surface. There was a fire. A chimney fire, in the old house. Happened fast. He spoke to the flames, not to her, his voice a monotone recital of a story he had told himself 1,000 times in the dead of night. "My wife, Ellen. She went back in for Clara. The roof came down." He fell silent, but Ilara could hear the rest of the story in the terrible quiet. The screams, the heat, the helplessness. She could see now that the fire had never gone out for him. He still lived inside it. "I built that cabin with my own hands," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Thought it would be a fortress, a place to keep them safe." He finally looked at her, his eyes hollowed out by grief. "Nothing is safe." A tear she didn't know she'd been holding back slid down Ilara's cheek, freezing almost instantly. She didn't offer empty platitudes or say she was sorry. Her own life had taught her how useless those words were. Instead, she shared a piece of her own brokenness. "My mother," she said softly. "She used to pick wildflowers with me. Indian paintbrush, bluebells. She said every person had a flower that was their soul. After my father drank himself to death, she just wilted. She stopped going outside. It was like her flower had died on the vine. It was a small offering, a piece of her own past laid bare beside his. It was enough. A fragile bridge of shared loss was built between them in the flickering light of that small, hidden fire. He looked at her hand, resting on her belly. "What will you name her?" It was the first time he had acknowledged the child as a person, a future. "Hope," Ilara whispered without hesitation. "I'm going to name her Hope." Silas looked at the locket in his hand, then back at the fire. He gave a single, slow nod. The second day was harder. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, hiding the trail and making the horse's footing treacherous. Ilara felt weaker, and a deep, rhythmic ache had begun in her hips. Silas seemed to sense it, his pace slowing, his eyes constantly scanning her face, checking for signs of distress. In the afternoon, they were crossing a high, narrow ridge when the ground gave way. A small avalanche of snow and rock cascaded down the slope, taking the horse with it. The animal screamed, struggling in the deep powder, its leg bent at an unnatural angle. Silas reacted instantly, cutting Ilara free from the blankets just as the horse went down. He half carried, half dragged her to the safety of a rock outcropping. The horse's leg was broken. It was a death sentence out here. Silas approached the animal, his face grim. He spoke to it in a low, soothing voice, his hand on its neck. Ilara turned away, pressing her face into the cold rock, but she still heard the single, clean crack of the rifle shot that ended its suffering. They were on foot now, with only what they could carry. The sun was beginning to sink, and the temperature was dropping fast. "We have to keep moving," Silas said, his voice hard, but his eyes were gentle as he helped her to her feet. "It's not much further now." He took the heaviest pack, leaving her with only a small bundle of furs. He forged a path ahead of her, his own body acting as a snowplow, creating a trail for her to follow. She stumbled, her legs feeling like lead, but every time she faltered, his hand was there, steadying her, pulling her onward. It was the last of her strength, the last of her will, that carried her out of the dense woods and into a clearing. And there, nestled in a curve of a wide, churning river, sat a small stone cottage with a curl of smoke rising lazily from its chimney. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A woman was standing on the porch as if she had been waiting for them all along. She was small but unbent, her face a tapestry of wrinkles, her eyes as sharp and clear as river stones. This was Martha. "You brought the storm with you, Silas," she said, her voice dry like autumn leaves. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Silas just nodded, too weary for words. "And the fire I need you to keep lit." Martha's gaze shifted to Ilara, flicking over her swollen belly, her pale cheeks, her exhausted frame. She saw everything in a single, sweeping glance. "You did not make her this way." It was a question and a statement. "No," Silas said. "But now she is mine to guard." Martha stepped aside, holding the door open. "Then bring your charge inside. The river is rising, and the fools who follow you are not far behind." The inside of the house was warmer than Ilara could have imagined, filled with the earthy, complex scent of 100 different drying herbs that hung in bundles from the rafters. A hearty stew boiled gently on the hearth. It was a place of deep, ancient peace. Martha laid Ilara on a cot by the fire, her hands careful but sure, her touch surprisingly strong. "She's close," she said to Silas, who stood nearby like a stone sentinel. "The child wants to come. Soon." Ilara closed her eyes, letting the warmth soak into her, a profound wave of relief washing over her. They had made it. They were safe. As Silas turned to bolt the door, a low, deep rumble echoed from outside, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of the earth moving, of ice breaking, of the river beginning to swell with the meltwater from the mountains. At the exact same moment, a sharp, clenching pain seized Ilara's belly, far more intense than anything she had felt before. She cried out, her hands flying to her stomach, her eyes wide with a new, terrifying realization. The sanctuary had been reached, but the true trial had just begun. Part 5. When the river raged and the cradle cried. Sevens. The storm did not arrive. It detonated. The low rumble Ilara had felt through the floorboards became a deafening roar as the river, swollen with a winter's worth of melted snow, broke its banks. Water, the color of mud, and churned ice surged through the clearing, slamming against the stone foundation of Martha's cottage. The wind howled like a legion of banshees, tearing at the roof and rattling the window panes in their frames. It was as if the world itself was coming apart at the seams. And inside, in the small, flickering circle of lamplight, Ilara's world was doing the same. The pain that had seized her was no longer a dull ache. It was a living thing, a predator with claws that gripped and twisted deep inside her. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, as another contraction buckled her body. Martha was a whirlwind of calm, focused energy. She moved with a purpose that defied the chaos outside, laying out clean cloths, stirring a pot of herbs on the hearth, her weathered face serene. "The baby is impatient," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the tempest. "It has chosen a dramatic night to make its entrance." Silas, however, was frozen. He stood by the door, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a chair, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the room's warmth. The roar of the water, the scream of the wind, the sight of Ilara's body clenched in agony, it all conspired to drag him back into the fire. He could smell the smoke, feel the suffocating heat, hear the screams of his wife and daughter echoing in the howl of the storm. He was back in that night of failure, a helpless giant watching everything he loved turn to ash. He was not here, in this cottage. He was a ghost, trapped in the inferno of his own memory. Martha glanced at him, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "The past is a ghost, Silas," she said, her voice cutting through his stupor. "You can let it haunt you, or you can give it a proper burial. This woman needs a mountain to cling to, not a pile of rubble. Be useful." Her words were a slap, a harsh but necessary jolt back to the present. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a strength that humbled him. She was fighting, not just against the pain, but for the future she held inside her. She was doing what he had failed to do. She was protecting her child. Across the raging torrent, huddled beneath a granite outcropping, Bartholomew Thorne watched the small, defiant light of the cottage. The river was an impassable, churning beast, and the storm showed no signs of abating. "Damn this wretched country," he snarled, wiping rain from his face. Jedediah shivered beside him, looking less like a partner in crime and more like a drowned rat. "We can't get to him, Mr. Thorne. Not till this blows over." Thorne's lips curled into a cruel smile. "She's not going anywhere. Let the storm and the river do the hard work for us. Let it soften them up. When the sun rises, we'll cross this creek and collect my property. Whatever's left of it." He settled back against the rock, content to wait, a vulture circling a battle it was certain to win. The threat was not gone, it was merely patient. Back in the cottage, the battle raged. Ilara's labor was long and brutal. Hours bled into one another, each one marked by an escalating cycle of pain and exhaustion. The storm outside seemed to feed on her agony, its fury rising with every one of her cries. Silas, finally shaken from his paralysis by Martha's words, began to move. He did not know what to do, so he did the only things he knew how. He fetched more water. He added logs to the fire, turning the hearth into a blazing furnace that beat back the cold. He tore strips of clean linen when Martha asked for them. They were small tasks, but they were an anchor, a way to fight the feeling of helplessness that threatened to consume him. During one particularly vicious contraction, Ilara screamed, arching her back, her fingers clawing at the woolen blanket beneath her. "I can't," she sobbed, her voice breaking. I can't do this. Silas moved to her side then, his hesitation finally burned away by the raw sight of her struggle. He knelt by the cot and took her hand. It was a clumsy, uncertain gesture, but his grip was solid, unwavering. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice a low rumble against the shrieking wind. She squeezed his hand with a strength that should have been impossible, her knuckles digging into his. "You ran through a blizzard," he continued, his eyes locked with hers. "You crossed mountains. You are stronger than any storm." He began to breathe with her, deep, steady breaths. "Breathe with me, Ilara. Just like this. In and out." She followed his lead, her ragged gasps slowly falling into rhythm with his. He did not let go of her hand. He became her anchor, her mountain. He wiped the sweat from her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. He whispered words of encouragement, simple and gruff, but they were the truest words she had ever heard. He was no longer the ghost of the man who had lost a family. He was the guardian of one that was trying to be born. The fire in his past had been one of pure destruction. But this fire, the one in the hearth, the one in Ilara's fierce will to live, was a fire of creation, and he chose to stand in its warmth. Just after midnight, the storm reached its zenith. The wind tore a shutter from its hinges with a violent crash, and a torrent of icy rain and wind blasted into the room. At that exact moment, Martha leaned forward. "Now, child," she commanded, her voice rising above the gale. "Push. For your daughter. Push." Ilara screamed, a long, primal sound that was not of pain, but of pure, unadulterated effort. It was the sound of a life being torn from the veil, a sound of defiance against the entire, raging world. Silas gripped her hand tighter, leaning his strength into her, his own knuckles white, his face a mask of fierce concentration. "Again!" Martha urged. Ilara bore down, every fiber of her being focused on that single, impossible task. The cottage seemed to groan under the assault of the storm, and for a terrifying second, it felt as though the whole world would be washed away in darkness and floodwater. And then it came. A sound. Not the wind. Not the river. Not the thunder. A cry. Sharp, piercing, and miraculously alive. It sliced through the cacophony of the storm, a single, perfect note of victory. The child was born. Into the heart of the tempest, between two people who had been broken by the world, a new, whole life had arrived. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath. The wind died to a moan, and the relentless roar of the river seemed to quiet. Inside, a profound, sacred silence fell, broken only by the baby's lusty cries and Ilara's exhausted, relieved sobs. Martha worked quickly, cleaning the infant and wrapping her in a warm, dry cloth. She placed the baby on Ilara's chest. "She's strong," Martha said, a rare smile touching her lips. "Like her mother." Ilara stared down at the tiny, wrinkled face, at the impossibly small fists balled up in defiance. Slick with life, eyes blinking into the lamplight for the first time, her daughter was here. She was real. "She's perfect," Ilara wept, a soft, cracked laugh escaping her. Her gaze lifted, searching for and finding Silas. He stood a few feet away, his large frame trembling, his face streaked with sweat and tears he didn't know he'd shed. He looked at the baby, his eyes filled not with the ghosts of his past, but with a fragile, dawning, and utterly terrifying awe. Hope, Ilara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Hope." She reached out her free hand to him. "You held the storm back long enough for her to come." Hesitantly, he stepped forward. He reached out a large, trembling finger and gently touched the baby's tiny, grasping hand. At his touch, the baby stopped crying, her dark, new eyes drifting open to gaze up at him. For the first time in 5 years, something other than grief rose in Silas's chest. It was a feeling so foreign and so powerful, it hurt more than any axe swing ever had. It was warmth. Part 6. The weight of the axe, the warmth of the flame. Sevens. The world they returned to was thawing. The relentless white of winter was finally surrendering, revealing patches of dark, rich earth beneath. The snowmelt fed swollen creeks that gurgled with newfound life, and the air, for the first time in months, carried the scent of damp soil and the promise of spring. The journey back from Martha's cottage was slow, deliberate. They were no longer two fugitives running from a threat, but a family making a pilgrimage home. Hope, cradled securely against Ilara's chest, slept through most of it, a tiny, perfect bundle of peace. When the cabin came into view through the thinning trees, it looked different. It was no longer a hermit's refuge, a place of exile and grief, but a destination, a beginning. The days that followed were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the peaceful hum of a life being built. Ilara found a new rhythm, one dictated by the needs of her daughter. She nursed Hope by the fire, her soft humming of forgotten lullabies filling the cabin's corners, chasing away the last of the old ghosts. Silas, too, was a changed man. The haunted, restless energy was gone, replaced by a deep, grounded sense of purpose. He still rose before dawn to chop wood, but the sound of his axe no longer felt like a war against the silence. It felt like the steady heartbeat of their new life. He spent his afternoons not on the trap lines, but on the porch, a block of fresh, sweet-smelling pine in his hands. He was carving a new cradle. His large, calloused hands, so accustomed to the brute force of the axe, moved with an almost reverent tenderness, slowly shaping the wood, sanding every edge smooth, ensuring there would be no splinters, no rough places to mar a child's delicate skin. He carved flowers along its sides, simple wild blooms like the ones Ilara had told him about, the ones her mother had loved. He was not just building a bed, he was building a promise. He was rebuilding his own heart, piece by piece. His interactions with Hope were a study in gentle reverence. He would stand over her as she slept, his massive frame casting a protective shadow, his expression one of a man witnessing a miracle he still didn't fully understand. One evening, as Ilara rocked the fussing baby, Silas wordlessly took her. Hope, so small she seemed to vanish in his huge arms, immediately grew quiet, her dark eyes staring up at the landscape of his bearded face. He held her with a certainty that belied his inexperience, a silent declaration that these hands would never again be helpless. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. It was a Tuesday morning, bright and clear, when the final storm arrived. It came not with clouds and wind, but on horseback. Silas saw them coming from a long way off, two figures emerging from the tree line, moving with the arrogant certainty of predators who had finally cornered their prey. It was Thorn and Jedediah. Silas's face hardened, but there was no fear in his eyes. He walked inside, his movements calm. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and steady. "Take Hope into the pantry." Bolt the door from the inside. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." She saw the finality in his eyes and knew this was it. She clutched her daughter, her heart pounding, and did as he said, her last sight being of him taking the heavy axe from its hooks by the door. Silas did not wait for them to knock. He stepped out onto the porch, the axe held loosely in one hand, and stood there, a mountain of quiet resolve. Thorn and Jedediah reined in their horses a few yards away. Thorn's face was a mask of cold fury, his fine clothes splattered with mud. Jedediah looked gaunt, haunted, a man gnawed from the inside out by his own choices. "So, the hermit plays house," Thorn sneered, dismounting. "I've come for my property, Lumberjack. The girl and the child she produced while in my service." Jedediah stayed on his horse, his hand resting near the colt on his hip, avoiding his sister's name and Silas's gaze. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "There is no property of yours here." Thorn laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I have a contract, signed by her own brother. The law is on my side. Now, stand aside before I have my man here decorate this cabin with your brains." He took a step forward. Silas took a step forward to meet him, raising the axe slightly. Its polished edge caught the morning sun. "There is no law, no piece of paper, that gives one man the right to own another," Silas stated, his voice ringing with a conviction that was absolute. "That woman in my house is not property. She is a mother. And I," he paused, the word taking on a new and profound weight, "am her family. There is no claim here that matters." Something in his stance shifted. It was not just defiance. It was a terrifying stillness, the calm center of a storm, the kind of threat that came not from words, but from a man who had already lost everything once and had absolutely nothing left to lose but the one small light he had sworn to keep alive. Just as Thorn was about to give a signal, another sound joined the tense standoff, the steady plod of a third horse. Sheriff Brody emerged from the trees, his face grim, his hand resting on his own sidearm. He reined in his horse, placing himself between Thorn and the cabin. "Thorn," Brody said, his voice carrying the weary weight of authority, "your business in my town is concluded." Thorn spun around, his face contorted in disbelief. "Sheriff, thank God. Arrest this man. He is harboring a fugitive, a thief." Brody didn't even glance at Silas. His tired eyes were fixed on the rancher. "I've been doing some reading, Thorn. Seems to me that contract of yours looks a whole lot like illegal indenture, and threatening a man on his own property with armed force. Well, that's a crime I take very seriously." He looked at Jedediah. "As for you, selling your own kin is a sin the law may not have a name for, but God surely does. I suggest you both ride out of my jurisdiction. Now. And don't ever come back." Thorn stood there, sputtering, his legal authority dismantled, his hired muscle rendered useless by the simple presence of a badge worn by a man who had finally chosen a side. He looked from Brody's unwavering gaze to Silas's cold fury and knew he was beaten. With a final curse, he climbed back on his horse, and the two of them rode away, swallowed by the forest, their evil rendered impotent. Months later, the land was alive with the full flush of summer. The town of Solitude's End held its annual spring festival, a celebration of survival after another harsh winter. At the center of the festivities was a large bonfire, its flames leaping toward the twilight sky. The townspeople, who had once looked at Silas with a mixture of pity and fear, now greeted him with nods of quiet respect. Ilara stood before the fire, holding hope in a woven sling. She had been invited to speak, and though her voice trembled at first, it grew strong and clear as she faced the flames. "My name is Ilara," she said. "I came to these mountains shackled and sold by my own blood." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I ran, not because I was brave, but because the child inside me kicked so hard. I knew she was begging me to fight." She looked toward Silas, who stood near the edge of the circle, stiff in a clean shirt, a giant trying to make himself small. "I was not saved by a hero with a silver tongue. I was found by a man who said little, who cursed under his breath and never smiled. But he built fires when I was freezing. He stood between me and those who wished me harm. He never told me I would be safe. He simply made it true." She stepped back into the crowd, and in the warm, respectful silence that followed, Silas approached her. From his pocket, he drew a small, beautifully carved bird, its wings outstretched in flight. He crouched beside their daughter and gently placed the wooden bird into her tiny, grasping hand. "It was sharp once," he said, his voice rough with emotion, quoting the child's name back to her. "But I sanded it down. Now it's just hope." Later that night, they returned to the cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, slow and warm. Ilara rocked Hope, who slept peacefully in the new cradle. Silas sat nearby, watching them, his face softened by the firelight. The silence was comfortable, complete. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the burnt locket. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a steady hand, he worked the damaged clasp open. He walked over to Ilara and held it out for her to see. Inside, behind a cracked piece of glass, was a tiny, faded portrait of a smiling woman with kind eyes and a little girl with a mischievous grin. "Ellen," he said, his voice thick. "And Clara." He didn't close it. Instead, he walked to the mantel and placed the open locket beside the crude wooden frame his daughter had made all those years ago. The past was no longer a secret locked away in the dark, but a memory, honored and brought into the light. He came back and sat beside her, taking her free hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, a quiet, unbreakable bond. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, washing the world clean. But inside the small cabin, the fire burned bright and warm, its light falling on the faces of a man, a woman, and a child, a family, forged in a blizzard. Sevens. The story of Silas and Ilara is a testament to the quiet, stubborn resilience of the human heart in the face of a brutal world. It began in the heart of a blizzard, with a debt of blood and a desperate flight for survival, and ended in the gentle warmth of a hearth that had been reawakened from its ashes. We witnessed a woman, sold as property, who found the strength not only to save herself, but to bring a new hope into the world. We saw a man, entombed by a grief so profound it had silenced him for years, who learned that the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living. Theirs was not a romance of flowery words or grand gestures, but one forged in shared silence, in the practical language of survival, a mended boot, a bowl of hot stew, a steady hand in the midst of a storm. They teach us a powerful lesson. Family is not always the blood you share, but the shelter you build for one another. Home is not a place with four walls, but the safe harbor you find in a loyal soul. It is the quiet, unwavering promise to stand between someone you care for and the howling winds of the world, and to always, always keep the fire lit against the encroaching darkness. If this story of two broken souls finding their home in the wilderness touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope can be found in the most unexpected places. Your voice helps us keep these flames of forgotten tenderness burning brightly. Like this video if you believe in the power of second chances, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, making sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss a tale of hearts finding their way on the frontier. And now, we ask you, share your story with us in the comments below. What does the word home truly mean to you?